So welcome to the class on critical research, and we're going to be just covering the basics of what critical theory and critical research are about. Next week we'll talk about particular methodologies, and I'll be giving a research example. You can find the slides posted on the OWL site, and I'll try to make note of when I'm changing slides as I walk through the content. So I just recommend that you would open the slides and that you would follow along with my voice, because you won't be seeing anything on the screen other than me staring at my own laptop. So if we move to the second slide where it says critical paradigm, I wanted to situate you both historically but also intellectually into this work. And the first three slides I wanted to share with you are three images that capture the nature of the kind of passions and concerns that folks have who tend to do research in the critical paradigm. And you saw this in the readings, and you'll be hearing about this, and it's ideas of social justice, of equity, of emancipation. And so before I talk about the history and the praxis, I wanted to show these images. And so this first one here is actually one of the most distressing images that I wanted to share, and partially because we've just had yesterday or 2 days ago the Holocaust Remembrance Day. This is actually an image from the Auschwitz camp, and the scratch marks on the wall are left by folks who were, this is a gas chamber, left by folks who were taken to the chambers and killed, and those are the scratch marks for them trying to escape. And I share this particular image because we'll talk in a second about the role of Jewish German philosophers and theorists in starting the roots of this paradigm, and how that came out of some of the horrors of World War II. The next slide, the image of the child. This is a child whose parent was a member of the KKK, and the KKK was having a protest at this time. Protest against integration of black people into schools where normally there was whites only. And again, a powerful image that captures some of the history of the critical paradigm around some of these social movements and concerns of racism, of power, of the history of oppression in America and elsewhere. And then the third image, this is a woman being arrested, protesting to get the right for women to vote. I believe this is in the UK. And again, feminism being a significant stream in the critical paradigm. So I thought those were three powerful pictures just that capture that sense of, that drive for a fairer world, a better world, a more just world, a safer world, a world free of oppression, of horror, of trauma, are all different pathways into the passion of critical researchers. So let's move to slide 5, the philosophical roots of the paradigm. And so you would have seen in the one reading reference to Karl Marx. And I just wanted to preface this because I know Marx and Marxism, there's a lot of kind of baggage that comes with that because of the political history of different governments who have taken up Marxist philosophy and turned it into politics. That part of it aside, Marx was a prolific theorist and philosopher, and a number of his points were very important foundations of thinking about the way that power is utilized within society. And one of the key pieces in terms of the critical paradigm was Marx's critique of ideology. And what he pointed out at that time that was, fairly new to people writing about this was that there's often the story under the story when it comes to social ideologies, that there's kind of the face value of the perspective that's trying to be shared, but then there's often kind of something that's underneath of that. And so he began to talk about, that art isn't just benign, that what we choose to take images of, and my examples in the previous slides, I think, are one example of this, is that art tells a message, and that message is sometimes more explicit, sometimes more implicit. But that art isn't necessarily value free or value neutral. Same with media, that even free presses that are supposed to be unbiased are ways that social messages are shared, created, perpetuated, and that policy, that you can analyze laws, policy, to see what's the social message that's being shared through that policy. And so Marx started this journey of these deeper kind of critical reflections that we see in a lot of the current researchers who've come since him. And then attached and connected to some of these same streams was the work of Max Horkheimer and others within the Frankfurt School. So there's a dozen excellent prolific researchers that we could cover with the Frankfurt School, but I just use Horkheimer as one example. For the scope of this class, it's more than enough. But as mentioned when I showed the slide from Auschwitz, Horkheimer was a Jewish German intellectual, and like many within the Frankfurt School and elsewhere, had expressed vocal concern about the Nazi Party as it was coming into power within Germany. And so once the Nazi Party did take power, had kind of two levels of risk. So being Jewish obviously put him and his colleagues at risk, as well as what they had expressed previously publicly about their issues with Nazism. And so, like many, he fled the country and he ended up coming to America. And so you can imagine someone who's already thinking about, what Marx talked about in terms of like, what's the ideology under the ideology, and he's thinking about the Nazi Party, for example, and here's what they're saying they're offering people, like the great German people, but what does that actually mean? What's underneath that, implicit in that? And then ends up literally being chased out of his own country and watching the horrors of the Holocaust. And so you can imagine what that does for him as a philosopher, and where he goes with his philosophy. And so, of course, has a number of concerns about oppression in general. But he also did look at systems of economy and how there are challenges inherent in capitalism as well that constrain the freedom of people. And that's around things like, everything only being as valuable as its financial worth, down to humans and everyone's time essence being commodified, and that capitalism in a way enslaves us into this kind of purchasing focus, that value is based on ownership of goods, and that even the goods that people seek are often very hegemonic. So, clothing styles are created by the brands and then are perpetuated through media, and so there's this constraint in human freedom that comes through the nature of capitalism and purchasing, and so for sure focus on emancipation and freedom from injustice, but also looked at how economic systems themselves can have injustices built within them. So in the next slide, we think about the roots of research. So let's think about the journey that we've been on in terms of talking about ontology and epistemology. So we've already established that in newer perspectives on research, there's this consideration that reality is temporal, it's contextual, that there's no kind of permanent, knowable, accessible reality. What is reality is what we can describe in the here and now, and that's very subjective in nature, that we each see the world through our own lens, and that's okay. We don't have to eliminate that subjectivity, that we can accept that subjectivity. We also talked last week about that idea of the researcher as instrument, and we're talking about this in ethnography. So not only is reality subjective, but as people whose job is to describe reality or create knowledge, they are always doing that through their self. They can't separate themselves with what they're observing, describing, creating. In the same way, we also mentioned that in some research that injustices can be uncovered. We talked about this when we talked about ethnography again. Was that idea that within cultures you can see power and power struggles and disempowerment and inequities. And we've also started to talk about that idea of the impact of research. We'll talk about this a lot more when we talk about knowledge translation later on. So taken all together, if the researcher is involved in the work, and that is okay, they can be present in the space, they can be engaging intersubjectively with research participants, and then they uncover an injustice that is happening in where they are focusing their work, then shouldn't the researcher do something about that? So if we're responsible as researchers to do something with the knowledge that we create, and we see that there is a problem in the world, then should we not be the ones who assist with changing that problem or doing something about that? So you can see there's the philosophical understandings of emancipation, of that critical consciousness of underlying messages and powers. At the same time, this growing sense within the research world that it's actually okay for us to further break the boundaries, right? We've already broken a lot of boundaries in science by moving into the interpretive perspective. And now we're saying within critical, we're going to break that next boundary, which is not just being creators of knowledge, but being people who put knowledge into practice, particularly for emancipatory means. And so hopefully that makes sense. Like you can see that natural progression of history and how, each step along the way of kind of opening up those assumptions of science gives a new form, a new way of being, a new paradigm within research. And so the third aspect in terms of the history of it on slide 7 is the roots in praxis, which is this putting into action knowledge for the sake of social justice. And so you should recognize 2 of these from my presentation on my own work last week, but these are some examples of people. Oh, sorry. I've been up late at the hospital. Of people who have done, who have created knowledge and then put knowledge into action in the world. And so the first one's Paulo Freire. His first book actually is called Pedagogy of the Oppressed. I believe I mentioned him already, but I'll just repeat briefly. He was a Brazilian educator and very concerned with the oppression of the Brazilian people. And the vast majority at this time were subsistence farmers who were illiterate. And so Freire was trying to shift some of the politics in Brazil, but realized very quickly that most of the population couldn't really engage with the politics because they simply couldn't read. And so if he wanted to change that kind of essential disempowerment, that he had to find ways to assist people to become literate. And so pedagogy means basically education. And so pedagogy of the oppressed was, teaching those oppressed in Brazil how to read and write, so therefore they could become empowered to be more engaged in their society, ultimately to create political change. Freire was actually kicked out of the country for this because of the political nature of his work, but had massive success ultimately in terms of shifting the population from majority illiterate to majority literate. And he's died a few years ago now, but before he died, he wrote this follow-up to that, Pedagogy of Hope, that presents a more positive perspective on the future after having completed this important work. The next one is Noam Chomsky. Noam Chomsky is an incredibly prolific author and thinker and activist. His background is in anti-war movements in the 60s in the US. He's 90 years old or so now. But through the anti-war movement, what was important to him was really how the government was constructing narratives about the war, how the American government was justifying to the American people that they should be in this war in Vietnam. And so, again, very similar to what we talked about in terms of Marx, was really thinking about words and messages and how ideology is crafted through the way that we share these messages. And this led him to really a lifetime of interest in language, in words, and it should, hopefully those of you, especially who did 661 with me, know that I've, also very passionate about words and the meaning in words, and owe some of that to having read a number of Chomsky's pieces. And so this particular text, very interesting, looks at basically how words are used to create belief and understanding in the population to support what are some at times unjust practices. So the third one here is Bell Hooks, and she is a black feminist activist and writer from the US, and she has also a prolific author, but no surprise, her background is in the feminist movement. What's important about the works of Bell Hooks is that she finds that intersection of talking about both race and gender. And so there was some division within the feminist and the human rights movements in the US, and at times playing against each other in terms of how those social movements were taking place. And so Bell Hooks is important in that she's able to bring both of those concerns together in a very thoughtful way. So there are countless other examples of academics who are activists, who take knowledge and put knowledge into practice, but those are three of the kind of more important ones that I wanted to share with you. So there's philosophy, there's the moment in time in research, and there is this political social action that come together to form this paradigm. So in terms of the ontological perspective on slide 8, is what I mentioned before, is that subjective nature of reality, that we can't necessarily capture empirically the nature of reality, of human meaning. We can get pictures of, we can get understandings of, but they will always be imperfect and bounded in time. And from a critical lens, they will be reflective of our own biases and our own, things that may actually be limiting to the freedom of others. Epistemologically, very much grounded in culture, so language being very cultural, points of oppression being very cultural. And I should mention the concept of social locations, because that's terminology you may run into as well. So social location is basically those various ways by which we categorize humanity. So race, gender, class, ability, age, just all of those different ways by which we see difference within humanity, those are called social locations. And so the epistemological view is that the nature of reality is very much connected to our social location. So slide 9, the change orientation, very important, but also one of the most difficult parts. And we'll talk about this more next week when we talk about specific examples. But in critical research, so it's that if you've got this knowledge of this problem in society, that you are responsible to do something about that. In the reality of how research systems work, you're funded to collect the data, and you should write it up at the end. There isn't space in traditional research funding for you to then spend time translating that knowledge into your communities, whatever country. And so the social change orientation is an important part of critical research, but it's also one of the parts that is most critiqued in terms of, this research said it was critical, but all they did was write an article at the end, and there was no real change that was made. Same with participatory action research. We'll talk about this next week. But participatory research is relatively easy, meaning I'm including people in my work. Participatory action research, meaning we're including people in the work and we're going to do something about the knowledge, is much harder. And I'll never forget a researcher who told me, your problem is that you want to change the world. And she wasn't wrong. It is a much more difficult path as a researcher to think that you can create change rather than just creating knowledge. All right, so slide 10, number of the pieces that you'll see. And again, no single project has to have every single one of these elements, but these are the common elements that you will see in the critical work. So the focus in terms of the population being studied is very often those experiencing some form of oppression, some form of inequity, some form of marginalization. Now, that's not, it's not entirely so. So for example, there's critical work that's done on nurses. And so if you look at the population of nurses as a whole, there are a number of social locations by which they are quite advantaged. So nurses are well paid. In Canada, nurses tend to be not just well paid, but tend to have a higher family income, so tend to marry well financially. There's also lower ethnic diversity amongst nursing than other professions, so more likely to be the race of the majority of the population. So, there's a number of ways that nurses are advantaged. But in doing critical research, you might look at points of disadvantage. So you might look at kind of the gendered nature of decision making and the relationship between medicine and nursing or something like that. Or you might look at the way that healthcare systems take advantage of nurses to do extra free labor, coming early and staying late at shifts and stuff like that. So even if you can't frame the whole population as marginalized, there might be points of marginalization, or there might be subpopulations. But yeah, you'll see a lot of research is focused on, racialized populations, people experiencing poverty, basically anyone experiencing isms, racism, sexism, homophobia, discrimination of any kind. And as I mentioned, there should be an action component, so the folks who you're working with should see some benefit out of the work. There is a reflexivity component, so just like we talked about with the interpretive, you should be talking about who you are. But it's not just reflexivity about who you are, it's also being honest about the advantages that you have in the work and that you might get out of the work. And then also laying out any biases or assumptions that you may be having. Lots of the foundations or justifications for research in the critical paradigm is, so I mentioned, you're trying to explain there's a gap in the knowledge and your research is trying to fill that knowledge gap. And so often the gap that is identified is a gap based in bias. So, there's been all this research that's been done on nursing students, but no one's talked about what it's like to be, an indigenous nursing student. So it's saying, like, there's just been this blindness in terms of the work that we've been doing so far, and so we're going to fill in that gap. The processes, and you'll see these when we talk about the methodologies, are often very intersubjective, not necessarily with something like discourse analysis, but in terms of feminist and participatory research and critical ethnography, very connected with the participants. Not always, but again, you don't have to have all of these tenets, but very frequently. So slide 11, we have a quote by Patty Lather. Patty Lather, critical feminist researcher, I love her work. I use it, as I mentioned in my presentation, my dissertation, I use it to help me know that I am doing rigorous work within the critical paradigm. So I use some of the things that she talks about. So she says that doing critical inquiry means taking into account how our lives are mediated by systems of inequity such as classism, racism, sexism, and heterosexism. And so it's that open lens to where are those points of advantage and disadvantage. How are social locations structured in our society, and what does this mean for the freedom, the opportunity, the well-being of all people, and who might be missing out because of the way that our society's disadvantaged certain people. So obviously there are some necessary assumptions there in terms of working in this paradigm. So you don't have to go very far down a CBC article comment section to realize that there are people who simply don't believe in sexism or racism or classism or those kinds of things. So I mean, well, I said that you don't have to fulfill all the tenets of the paradigm to work in this area. There's a basic need for you to understand injustice and inequity exist, and be concerned about that. So why would we use this within nursing? So there's a couple pieces to it. One is very often that action element. So really, in terms of why wouldn't you just do an interpretive or constructivist? Why would you do critical research on a particular topic? So often it's because you want to do some kind of action-oriented work. You don't want to just understand what is the meaning of, what is the experience of. You don't want to just create a theory of how something happens. You want to intervene. You want to change. Another reason can be because you're looking for a different form of engagement. So particularly phenomenological work and very often grounded theory work, you're very you're still kind of coming in as the external researcher and keeping some level of separation between yourself and the participants. Critical can often be done because one wants to, directly engage with the research participants, wants to have them involved. Or maybe the research participants are inviting the researcher in a particular way, so it makes sense to do that. Or it's chosen because you want to focus on a particular point of disadvantage. So you don't want to just look at a whole culture, you want to zoom in on problematic cultural elements of power and oppression. So it can be sometimes because of how you want to do the work, what you want to come up with, or where you want to put your focus of your research. I already mentioned some of how we use this in nursing when we think about nurses, but we also see a lot of critical research being done around populations who don't or who have inequitable health outcomes. So, why are indigenous people much more likely to smoke? And so if we're coming from a public health perspective and we know that smoking prevention is important, then we're trying to understand smoking, but not from that individual kind of behavior, like, why do these bad people not do what they should be doing? Instead, it's thinking about what are the social conditions by which this particular population is disadvantaged into this behavior. And so, so very often critical work being done to look at those health inequities and create particular knowledge and action to address those inequities. So in terms of methodologies on slide 13, last week we talked about critical ethnography. Next week we're going to talk about feminist and participatory action research. So just the one I wanted to present as an example, because I know it helps to move from the theoretical to the practical, is to speak about discourse analysis. And I already introduced this a little bit when I talked about Marx and Chomsky, and that idea of kind of thinking about what's the social message underneath here. How are we creating reality through this particular message? There's actually been a lot of great examples in this right now. For example, in the body positive movement, and that idea that how we advertise frames what is perceived as the norm, and that if everyone on every ad for clothing or gyms or whatever is at an unhealthy BMI, then we're actually making a message that this BMI is desirable. And we know kind of all the downstream consequences to that in terms of people, risk of eating disorders and kids' self-esteem and Instagram culture, and et cetera, et cetera. And so you see more advertisers using models within a healthy BMI instead of a underweight. And so the discourse analysis there is like, okay, this advertisement isn't just an advertisement. There's a message here, intended or unintended. It's not saying that there's like secretly evil people in the corporations trying to make us all anorexic. It's saying that there are stories that come out of the things that we say and we show and we do. And so slide 14, discourse analysis explores the ways that sentences and speech go together to make text and interactions, how those texts and interactions fit into our social world. And I would add to that, like, the message that's being created through those texts and speech. And so, simple example of this in healthcare is one of your colleagues in this class has been talking about the idea of non-compliance and medication with youth with cystic fibrosis. And so that's a really interesting one for me, because you have these, there's all this, like, what's under that idea of non-compliance? Well, not compliant implies that that person is, refusing a particular intervention. And, in the healthcare setting, it has all sorts of nuance to it and meaning. And we kind of, when you say, oh, this patient is not compliant, you get this real particular image in your mind. But the alternative is to talk about, like, patient-centered or patient-driven care, client-centered, client-driven care. And so it's like, okay, well, there's a huge difference between being patient-driven and, they can take the medication that they want to take and they can do the treatments that they want to do. And if they know it's life-limiting and they choose not to do it, that's their choice. They write their care plan. And no one's going to ever be non-compliant to their own care plan. Well, yeah, I guess hypothetically they could be, but versus this idea of compliance, and so it's and so I think the other thing that's important to mention is that in this work, it's not always pointing about what's right and wrong. It's just helping shed light on what people might not be seeing. So someone who's using that terminology, non-compliance, all the time, they just might not even, think about what the implications are. And so it's to help shed light. In Paulo Freire called that conscientization, becoming conscious of something. So you don't realize that you're an oppressed, essentially servant, subsistence farming servant, working on other people's land, if you can't read and you don't know that this isn't what the rest of the world does. So becoming conscious of something one doesn't see before. And so discourse analysis can bring consciousness to things. So the next 3 slides, I had a little bit of fun with this one, is that the current Ontario government is great fun around how they package their messages, like nothing you've ever seen before, and it's a little out of George Orwell's 1984. But anyway, so I just picked 3 tweets, like practically randomly, out of the Ontario government to see what they're talking about and how they talk about it. So this one is Did you know more than 350 grocery stores across the province sell beer and cider, and over 70 sell wine? Authorized retailers are now able to sell from 9 a.m. to 11 p.m. 7 days a week. And in the press release, they talk about expanded hours of alcohol sales at grocery stores. And they have this little slogan that says modernizing alcohol sales. And so what's interesting from the discourse analysis is what does modernizing mean? Right? So in terms of alcohol sales, what is old-fashioned and what is modern? And is selling alcohol in a grocery store at 10 a.m. less modern than selling it at 9 a.m.? I would say that really those concepts of the hours of sale and the concept of modernization aren't connected. It's no more modern to sell it from till 7 p.m. or 8 p.m. or whatever. But modernizing as a word has positive connotation. So if we say that we are modernizing alcohol sales, then it sounds like we're doing a good thing, right? So again, it's not to say that I think alcohol shouldn't or should be, that I don't know, I never buy my alcohol at a grocery store. But what's interesting is the word that's being used and the meaning that's trying to be created by that particular word. So this next one, Ontario's Employment Standards Act has changed. Need a leave of absence from work? It's January 1, new laws have come into force. Find out what new rights you have. What new rights you have. Hashtag workfare. So what this tweet doesn't mention is they rolled back the new rights we were getting with the new legislation. So new rights is actually less rights. So you newly have less rights for absence from work than you used to have. Because the new one, you didn't have to get a letter from an employer or from a doctor for a number of absences and those kind of things. So they're rolling it back now that you do. So you don't have that same right and freedom to just be like, I'm sick, I'm not going to go in today. But of course, they don't say, find out how you have less rights. They've said, find out what new rights. And so how that terminology changes that message. Slide 17, the current social assistance system is ineffective and disjointed. That is why Ontario is designing a social assistance system to help people find and keep jobs and achieve better outcomes. Changes to the Ontario Works program will encourage people to move to employment faster. You know what the change was that they were announcing here? Ontario Works was supposed to increase on an annual basis, according to an inflationary calculation. They were now announcing that they were freezing and they would not be increasing the Ontario Works by that amount going forward. So lots of fun messages and discourses in this one, like Ontario's system is ineffective and disjointed. How? Who? What? Huh? What's the evidence on that? We're just saying words, and I mean, it's underfunded, but what's the effectiveness? People get money when they don't have money. There's job hunting and creation and education programs. What's the evidence? We're just saying words, but people if you tell someone, yeah, we've got a government program that's ineffective because of kind of biases around our public system, people will be like, oh yeah, that sounds about right. And so we're going to encourage people to move to employment faster. Sounds great. Encourage is a nice word. It's a happy word. We're encouraging them by giving them less money to survive by year over year as inflation increases the cost of living. So, I mean, I guess if at some point you're starving, then, There's some other type of motivation. But then there's this whole assumption that people aren't already encouraged because social assistance only gives you like half of a living wage. Only about not even 2/3, like 60% of minimum wage. So it's already a huge benefit to get a job. Like, you get way more than you would get on social assistance. So a lot of assumptions there. So again, just looking at how it's like, what are the words? What's the meaning behind these words? What's the words we're choosing? So slide 18, discourse analysis is based on 4 central assumptions about language. So the first is really that idea, and you saw this, anyone who did a concept analysis for 661 would see that, there's that diversity of definitions behind any single concept. So there's always this level of ambiguity within language. The second is that language is contextual. So absolutely, culture and history and language means different things. The same words mean different things to different times, different places, different people, different culture. So connected to that, language is very social, and who we are and how we are is based on our language, our interactions with each other, written or verbal. Lastly, that there are kind of layers of meaning that are added to language. So facial expressions affect language, the font we use. When Denise is posting pictures, it's our undergraduate counselor in the School of Nursing, from Mexico right now about how beautiful it is, and I use caps lock to reply to her about how it is in London right now. There's meaning behind the use of that particular caps lock. So there's other layers that give more meaning to our language. So then, thinking about slide 19, I gave one example of discourse analysis was around that idea of patient compliance. There's, any aspect of the profession. So the idea of a physician assistant, right? What's the terminology there? What does that mean? Versus a nurse practitioner, for example, and what's the kind of scope of the work, and what might be the assumptions between who has more independent practice, a nurse practitioner or a physician assistant, and how wrong those would be. So all sorts of ways to look at how language impacts the work of nurses and the impact in the health and well-being of the population. So then the last thing I wanted to do for this lecture is just look at our 3 examples of our readings and talk about how they've framed their purpose, questions, and methodologies. And so the first one is speaking of nurse practitioners and the empowerment around nurse practitioners. The first one is the Turner article, and this is a discourse analysis, critical discourse analysis. And what I wanted to show with this one is that often the purpose and the question are pretty much identical, but not always, as you'll see from the other examples. So the purpose was to examine the social discourses of nursing. The question is, what are the social discourses of nursing? And so I know some of you are struggling in terms of creating your critical paradigm question, because sometimes the social justice aspect of it is very explicit within the question, but it doesn't have to be. So here's a question that is very benign in terms of like the power piece, right? So it's just like, what are these social discourses? It doesn't say social discourses that limit the autonomy of nurses, that make nurses oppressed, that so that, yeah, it doesn't have to explicitly capture that in the question. What I do know is by saying, you know, what are the social discourses, and even that mention of autonomy, those are cluing me into where we're going with this being critical. But then it becomes totally explicit when they say the methodology is critical discourse analysis. I just gave one of your colleagues feedback on this and gave them a question that didn't include that explicit oppression piece in it. But it's okay. Doesn't have to be right there in the question. It can be there in the purpose. It can be there in the methodology. So the next is the Mahan article, example of critical ethnography. So what we talked about last week. And the purpose here is to challenge assumptions about why nurses choose to remain in or leave bedside positions, explore how issues of fairness and equity contribute to these decisions. So there, in the purpose, you can see the fairness, the equity. Whereas the question itself, how do nurses decide to remain in or leave bedside nursing, is, again, it's a fairly benign question. Though the how gets you closer, because it's not a like, what are the experiences, what is the meaning. What I wouldn't necessarily be able to distinguish right off the bat on the how is, are we doing a grounded theory or something else? Are we doing something in the critical? Because the critical is good at uncovering social processes that a how kind of question would get at. But you could also be, the how could also be a creation of a theory. The other thing I want to mention is that the question was implicit. So in post-positive research, thou shalt name your research question. The research question is often in the abstract. There's a little section, research question, : here's the question. In critical work, because we are not theory testing, it's not considered within the profession a requirement that you name a research question. We do it, we have you do it as a good practice, as a best practice, but it's not a ubiquitous practice. So you can get away with not having an explicit research question in a within a critical paradigm. So same with the next one. I basically made up what I am sensing their research question is through what I'm reading. So that takes us to this last one, the Kaja article, the purpose of which is to uncover the colonial oppressive practices of international mining and the impact on impoverished indigenous people in Guatemala. So, lots of very clear critical stuff there. So colonialism, oppression, an identified vulnerable population of concern. And again, the implicit research is, what is the impact of a Canadian mine on the health of indigenous people in Guatemala? And again, that question isn't named, but I'm sure that's what they're looking at. So then again, the terms of the question, what is the impact of it that could be approached ethnographically? There could be a phenomenological element to that. What is the impact? What is the experience? But then in reading the purpose and reading this methodology of an anti-colonial narrative approach informed by participatory action research principles, very clear right away that this is critical work. It also, so that phrasing of the anti-colonial narrative approach informed by participatory action research principles shows us a little bit of the muddy ground that is methodology within critical. So in interpretive, it was like pretty clear: phenomenology, grounded theory, ethnography, couple subtypes. Within critical, we get super imaginative. So there is a freedom within this paradigm, which is not surprising because, I mean, the whole concept is like get rid of oppression for human freedom. Therefore, also be free and do things in new and cool ways, as long as we can all make sense of what you're doing. And I hope this article gave you good, like it reads really straightforward, even though there's like a lot of complexity in it. So like if you like went to your friend or partner or family or whatever and said anti-colonial narrative approach informed by participatory action research principles, they'd be like, what are you talking about? But this actually reads quite straightforward because she's used some license, but she has been coherent and cohesive in how she's done that. So we talk about discourse analysis, feminist, participatory action, critical ethnography, but there is a whole rabbit's warren of ways that you can connect those together. Because you already may have noticed the one said critical discourse analysis instead of just discourse analysis. I suspect there's no difference there. They're just putting in that word critical to make it very clear. Their paradigmatic perspective. But you can do, feminist participatory action research. You can do, like I said, you can do participatory action research or participatory research. You can do, there's a lot of post-colonial research and the argument of post-colonialism as a methodology, anti-colonial, which actually honestly was new to me before I saw this work. And then she's also mentioned this narrative approach, which kind of bumps us into methods. But you'll see people talk about critical narrative research, feminist narrative research. So yeah, sorry to confuse things right at the end with that, but I did want to be honest about it, that within critical there's a lot of playing around with these different elements and combining them in different ways. Again, as long as you're doing it thoughtfully and clearly of what the combination means in terms of actually putting the research into practice. Yeah, so hopefully that was helpful. I'm sure you'll have questions for me. I will make sure I put time in our next class to answer those questions. And I thank you for your attention and hope this was helpful to you. And you can also email me if you have any questions. So yeah, all the best, and I'll talk to you soon.